Netherlands 2, Japan 2, and who knows, maybe one day I will choose a game where we actually get a winner at this World Cup, but not today. Instead, we have to settle for another fascinating tactical battle. So let's not waste any time here. Let's get straight into the tactics, because there was a lot to talk about in this game. I think both the Japanese side and the Dutch side were a little bit unconventional, a little bit untraditional with how they set up. They didn't play necessarily in the way that a lot of club teams do currently, and it made for a really interesting game. A game which probably started a little bit slow, right? In the first half, it didn't have the zip, the intensity, the sharpness, and the snappiness almost, which you want from these World Cup games. And I think some of that comes because both teams were quite passive with their defensive approach. If we start with Japan, we can see that on paper, it's a back three, but quite often it actually converts into more of a back five. So for the Dutch, that means that they are going to have time to get on the ball. The likes of Van Dijk and Van Hecker are going to have a lot of touches and be able to play out from the back. In terms of the shape that they were looking to use, we saw something quite similar to what we saw in the second half from Brazil in yesterday's video, where the back four stay as that, a back four, which, like we said, is quite different to what we see at club level at the moment. A lot of teams choose to build up either with two centre-backs or some sort of back three. But the Dutch, a bit like Brazil, were choosing to build with a really deep back four, with the fullbacks really sort of deep and connected to those centre-backs once again. And I think the reason why they were trying to do this, well, there's two. The first one is it sort of gives you a little bit of security to the counter-attack. If you push your fullbacks really high up the pitch and then lose the ball, there's a lot of space for Japan to attack. Whereas by keeping these fullbacks a little bit deeper, you're being a little bit safe, a little bit pragmatic. You're almost looking after yourself. And I think in the groups, sort of the way that it's set up this year, you can do this. You can get away with this. You can sort of get through the group by drawing every game. What you don't want to do is lose your first one for the sake of momentum. So I think this is some of the reason why we're seeing this type of approach. The other reason we saw it in this game was because of the numerical overload that it gave the Dutch in the first phase. You see, Japan have got a back five, two midfielders, and then a front three. So as the front three try and jump up here, we can see that they are going to be outnumbered. It's 4 versus 3 in the favour of the Dutch, with someone like Frenkie de Jong dropping in as well. So this is why the Dutch were able to have a lot of touches on the ball. They had a lot of control in the first half of the game. They found it quite easy to move through the first couple of thirds of the pitch. However, the Japanese did eventually start to apply pressure, especially when the ball came down this side of the pitch, down the Japanese left-hand side. So over here, Japan are passive. It's a back five, it's then a 2 in midfield, and it could even become a bit of a 4 in midfield, or sometimes a bit of like a 5-3-2 like this. And Japan were quite comfortable here. The players sort of all know their roles. They're a very well coached side. However, on the other side of the pitch, the second the ball would come to someone like Dumfries, who can now play a little bit higher, and Somerville gets involved as well, now Japan become more aggressive. The left wing-back jumps higher, becoming a left-sided central midfielder, the left centre-back becomes a left-back, and the middle centre-back becomes a left-sided centre-back. So now we can see that Japan have jumped into a 4-4-2 shape. So they've gone from a back 5 to a back 4, meaning they've got one extra player just a little bit higher and can get pressure on the ball. So over here, Japan were quite passive, but the second the ball was coming over here, they jumped, they were aggressive, and very well drilled. Now, early on in the game, this was something that the Dutch side struggled with. The men in orange struggled to get the ball speed. The ball wasn't moving quick enough, so they weren't sort of testing these Japanese players frequently enough. They weren't really testing that defensive system. However, as they sort of warmed up and grew into the game, which happens at international tournaments, it takes a little bit of time to get going. There's so much anticipation and excitement and expectation before a tournament that sometimes it takes a little bit of time to warm up. You may not see the best of a side until game week 3. But what we did see was eventually that the Netherlands side started to warm up into the game. And they used a slightly different midfield approach to what we expected on paper. So on paper, a lot of people had this down as sort of a 4-2-3-1, which means you're going to have 2 deeper central midfielders and then the higher 10. But what we actually saw more frequently was more of a 4-3-3, where Frenkie de Jong would play as sort of a solo pivot at times in possession, and the 2 other midfielders would move a little bit higher. So that is one thing that we need to remember for this game. The other thing is the wide zones. We've seen already that the fullbacks started quite deep, and we know that this has the effect of dragging Japanese players out of position. They're dragged a little bit higher into these zones over here. What the Dutch were then trying to do was find their wingers. Easy access into the wingers, both Gakpo on the left-hand side and also Somerville on the right. Can you get them the ball? Can they go 1 versus 1? Yes, they could get them the ball. Quite often, they didn't have the solutions 1 versus 1. I think there was a lot of threat here from the Dutch, but it never really became anything. There was almost no substance to it. They were trying in these areas. I think Gakpo was sort of a threat throughout the game. He was almost teasing that he was going to do something at some point, that he was going to sort of burst into life, but he was probably just a little bit too predictable. Again, especially in the first half when they weren't moving the ball very well, is a little bit predictable. But the one thing that the Dutch did have throughout this game, even when they were slow in the first half, was the access in midfield. You see, because the fullbacks were deep, it drags the wide Japanese players higher and wider into these positions out here. This then means that we've got a little 2 versus 2 in the middle of the pitch. But, as you can see, we've got marked out, it could become a 3 versus 2 with Frenkie de Jong in the middle. So there were moments where Frenkie de Jong would pick the ball up in the middle of the park, and the 2 wider midfielders would be exactly that, wider midfielders. So they're central midfielders, but going to pull a little bit wider. And the reason why they want to do that is because now they can receive this sort of diagonal pass. So Gravenberch, when he gets the ball, can receive with his body open. You can see it here. He receives the ball, so the ball goes into midfield. Gravenberch is quite wide for a central midfielder. Outside the Japanese midfield, Gravenberch gets his body open to receive the ball, moves forward, and a couple of touches later, that is where the Netherlands get their goal from. So this is something that they need to do more of. They need to get the likes of Gravenberch and Reinders side on in midfield. If they do this more frequently in the tournament, as it progresses, if they're sharper, these two can be very dangerous because they're very good players, very good sort of box-to-box central midfielders. They've got engines on them. They can go for 90 minutes, but also there's a real technical empathy to their game as well. This is something that Netherlands have to do more as they grow into the tournament. So, you know, Japan was solid defensively, very, very solid, very resolute. The Dutch sort of had nice ideas, but were a little bit too slow with the way that they moved the ball. However, when they were able to inject a little bit of speed, I think they started to look dangerous with the midfield 3 overloading in the centre, and then the wide players starting to take their man on. So what we need to do now is flip this all on its head and talk about Japan on the ball, where we are going to see some similar themes, some similar ideas in terms of it being a bit too easy to play out from the back. That is my main criticism of the two sides. I think if they want to go far at this tournament, they've got to pick their moments where they're going to be a bit more aggressive to apply pressure to the ball. Because if you don't, you allow the opposition to have touches and sort of come onto you. And we saw spells of that from both teams in this game, where both teams could have a 20-minute spell where they were knocking the ball back quite comfortably. And that's because there wasn't enough pressure. One of the reasons why the Netherlands really struggled to get pressure on the ball was because of this fella in here, Frenkie de Jong, who I think is a wonderful player. Absolutely love him. One of his biggest fans. But his defensive role in this game was really interesting. He's sort of this gliding maestro central midfielder is how I would describe Frenkie de Jong. But his defensive job, his role in the team, anytime Japan got the ball, Frenkie de Jong dropped into a centre-back position. And this is why we end up with a game which at times is a little bit passive, because the Netherlands themselves are also now defending with a back 5. Throughout the game, they did this for the whole 90 minutes. Frenkie de Jong, every time Japan got the ball, Frenkie de Jong would drop deeper, which means Reinders in midfield also has to drop deeper. Somerville and Gakpo do the same, and now the Dutch are in a 5-4-1 shape like the Japanese were, and now it becomes more passive. The Dutch shape was probably even more passive than what the Japanese one was. There was less triggers to jump, but I did think defensively they were still pretty resolute. I just felt that the Japanese had a bit more about them in terms of solutions to how they were approaching this. So what we need to do is talk about the back 3, which might sound a little bit weird. We're talking about the attack here for Japan, and we're going to start off with the centre-backs, who I think played a really important role with a little bit of help from Kamada in midfield. So when we see a back 3 with 3 centre-backs, sometimes there can be a slight concern that you're going to be a little bit not too defensive, but a little bit too cautious in possession. Are you going to commit enough players forward? You've got 3 centre-backs on the pitch who aren't traditionally the greatest problem solvers in possession. But I think the way that they were used tactically was fascinating. So the 2 wing-backs are going to go nice and high. And I think that's a great starting point. You've then got the striker and you've got the 2 10s. But what we saw at the back here was really interesting, because Kamada playing in midfield would actually often drop almost like an extra centre-back. And now the wide centre-backs would split much wider. But not only wider, higher, especially down the left-hand side. He would really like fly forward. It was like watching a fullback, even though he was playing centre-back. So this was something that Japan did very, very well. They stretched the Dutch front line horizontally across the pitch. Right, so let's say Japan had stuck with Kamada in midfield and sort of a narrow back three. The Dutch side themselves could have become quite narrow, right? They could have sat in their position, really tight, really compact, and Japan would have struggled to find a way through. But because Kamada drops so deep, the wide centre-backs then split. What you do is you sort of stretch the Dutch. You know, Gakpo's forced to go a little bit wider. Somerville does the same over here. You sort of stretch that Dutch team horizontally. So this was fascinating to watch from the Japanese. Seeing wide centre-backs playing so wide. I mean, the left-sided centre-back here, he's almost like an underlapping fullback in this moment of the attack. It was great to see them attacking in this way. We can see it on the right-hand side as well. The centre-back galloping forward. And it really made them a threat out wide because there were so many players in these areas. However, what I actually enjoyed even more about Japan was their ideas on the ball. So not just about the centre-back splitting wider and stepping forward, but sort of the philosophy with which they were playing. There's a very clear instruction here from the manager to the players, and they take those instructions on board very well. I will sort of say I don't think Japan were amazing. I think if they could have found a bit more technical quality on the day, if they were a bit sharper with some of their link-up work, they're a team to watch at this tournament. I will say that much. There is a team to watch here. I think for both sides, they can go far in this tournament if they just find a way of clicking a little bit better. For Japan, what I really love about the performance is the way that the players are always doing the opposite to each other. Now, when you first hear that, you might think, that's a bad thing. Does that mean the players are on the wrong wavelength if they're always doing different things to each other? But what I'm actually talking about is opposite movements. So if one player picks up the ball, the players in front of them are going to be making different movements, particularly between the wing-backs, the sort of wider 10s, and then the striker as well. They're making the opposite movement to each other. So let's say Kamada has the ball in midfield and looks up for a pass. He's going to have different runs and therefore can play different types of passes. So what he might see is his inside forward or his left 10 come towards him, but the wing back is actually going to fly forward and go the other way. And for the Dutch, this is difficult to defend. Your Van Hecker or your Dumfries, do you follow the run towards the ball? Do you go into that area like this, or do you cover the wing back run? No matter what you do, you're going to be leaving some space somewhere. So this was something that Japan did very well. Their movements were opposite to each other, so they could always find a little bit of space that they were able to work in. Something else that they did really, really well was use the wide zones with the wing back and the inside forward on the far side of the pitch. So when they move the ball nice and quickly, you quickly fire your ball out to your wing back. The Dutch fullback is required to go out there. Right, he's got to go and close the ball down. But anytime you do that as a fullback, you make that jump, you're really leaving yourself vulnerable to this run. This run in here from one of the 10s going into that zone, it's something that the Dutch side felt vulnerable to be honest, throughout the game. But I think the Japanese really attacked these spaces fantastically well. They were so good at getting into these positions. We can see it for the build-up for the first goal, I believe it was, down the left-hand side. You can see the ball out wide and then the underlapping run. And that's because Japan were willing to attack with 5 players on the front line, sort of overwhelming the Dutch. The other thing that Japan were able to do was use diagonal play to access the middle of the pitch, and again that's only possible because of the opposite movements. So for example, when the wing-back's got the ball, access to the striker looks quite difficult. That's a difficult pass to find because there's going to be Dutch bodies in there, there's Japanese players in there. It's sort of quite difficult to move the ball into that zone until you see runs off the ball. When the 10 makes the run in behind, dragging someone like Frankie de Jong and maybe even Reinders with him, and then the striker can drop into that space, and now Japan can play from the wing back inside the pitch. And this is what Japan needs to do more of if they want to go far at this tournament. If they want to hurt the rest of the teams in the group, which is very possible for them, if they want to make a statement and go far, this is where they need to be a little bit sharper. Because if they can do this well, it's a great idea, right? I always say this, the goal's in the middle of the pitch. You know, the goal isn't in the corner flag, it's not even over here, it's here. So what you need to try and do is find ways to get the ball in this zone, right? That's where you want to target. And I think Japan, in theory, have a great way of doing this. Because players are willing to make very selfless runs off the ball, it opens up these passing angles for someone else to receive quite an easy pass. And then you can see combinations and go forward. I just felt on the day, a bit like the Dutch, the quality was just lacking a little bit. There wasn't the sharpness to the play, the fluidity. Last 20 minutes, there were sparks of it. But I think overall, You know, the tactical level looks quite good, but I think the performance level can improve. So my final takeaway is that I don't think either team was amazing, but I think both teams showed a lot of potential. I think in possession, there's some good ideas there. They need to be a little bit more fluid with their movement for both teams. They've got to make more runs off the ball, more runs towards the ball, and just got to be sharper. The passing quality has to be better. If you want to go far, you've got to produce in moments. You've got to find your passes. You've got to zip it into each other. And I think both teams lack that a little bit. My main criticism would be, defensively, I think both sides are a little bit too passive at the moment. Defending in a back five for large parts of the game is going to keep you compact, but it is going to keep you under pressure against better sides. When you defend with a back five, you give the opposition the ball. And when you face, you know, a Brazil, a Portugal, a France, a Spain, whoever it might be, if you give them lots of the ball, they're going to hurt these sides. So I think they will, at some point, need to find a way to be more aggressive. But I do think, despite that, this was still a really, really interesting game. The way that both sides set up tactically. The Dutch building possession with a back four but defending in a back five. And then the Japanese defending in a back five, jumping into a back four. And centre-backs that were playing almost as wingers at times. And all of that diagonal play as well. I think it was fascinating to watch from both teams. They just got to speed it up, add a bit more individual quality, and I think both teams can cause problems at this tournament. So that's why I wanted to cover this game. Despite the fact that it was another draw, I still think it was very entertaining. But those, as always, are just my thoughts, my opinions. I want to hear yours in the comments down below. What did you think of the game? What impressed you the most? What surprised you the most? And who was your man of the match? Let me know what you think in the comments. But apart from that, we are now finished for today. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.